Mickey Mike. You are now tuned in to the Mind Wanderers podcast, the podcast where we wander and explore the world around us. I'm your host Timi, and this is episode 9. And we are back. Welcome to the Mind Wanderers podcast, the podcast where I take random topics, thoughts, questions, and ideas that our minds may wander to. I just want to say thank you to all the new listeners and welcome back to my fellow wanderers. I do get asked a lot what the podcast is about, and I do spend a lot of time thinking about this. I actually sent out a tweet to a guy on Twitter, and I basically asked him, he seemed like he was like a really big podcast guy, and I asked him, can I say that my podcast is eclectic? And eclectic basically means drawing inspiration from different sources. So because I kind of thought this podcast was a culmination of different genres, topics, ideas, and so I thought I can't really put it into one single genre. So I asked this guy, what should I do? And he replied back to me basically saying that I should really hone in into a single genre, as it will give the podcast a lot more focus. So I've spent a lot of time over the past 2 weeks trying to think of what genre best fits this podcast. It's definitely not a sports podcast, it's not a music podcast, it's not a comedy podcast, even though I do think I'm funny. But I'm trying to decide what area do I want to sit in, and so I finally settled on education. So I thought this podcast is more of an education around the world around us, and the way I kind of saw it is this podcast is that random thought you had on the train or while you're driving, or when you just have a second to think outside of the work you do or the responsibilities you have for the day. The podcast is just a form of asking a simple yet insightful question about learning the things you live alongside, or the culture we adopt, or the history and science behind things that are unexplained. And that's what I feel like this podcast is. So I think I'm going to settle on an educational podcast, but obviously as time moves on, as I bring on guests, as I have recurring guests, obviously you guys have mainly listened to my voice now, but I do promise you that guests are coming. And as this podcast begins to grow, I want it to more evolve from education to a discussion that leads to education. And so I think that is where the podcast is going to end up. And so the only way I can do this is by repeatedly bombarding you guys by saying, remember, you can follow the podcast on Instagram at mindwanderers_podcast, or on Twitter at mind_wanderers. Once again, that is Instagram at mindwanderers_podcast, or on Twitter at mind_wanderers. So we are now, or by the time you guys are listening to this, it is going to be the 1st of March. We're in a new month. I'm a Christian, so I believe in God. So I'm happy that I am here to celebrate the 1st of March 2020. It is not easy. That is a blessing in and of itself. So yep, I'm kind of thankful for that. If you don't believe in God, or you have a different religion, then give thanks to your respective deity. And if you don't believe in shit, then just thank your lucky stars that you're still here. So actually, speaking about Twitter, as I was mentioning just before, has anyone, and I would really like to hear people's feedback on this, has anyone heard about something called an alternative Twitter? And I recently discovered that alternative Twitter is a way of doing internal research and development on who you are as a person. And when I read the blog, it explained that having an alternative Twitter allows you to experiment with the different sorts of facets of your character, and then have that as a feedback loop into your real life character. So what people do is that they have a main Twitter account, and then they have alternative Twitter accounts, and it's effectively taking your personality and splitting it into the segments it is, and then keeping each segment in an individual Twitter account. And through those Twitter accounts, you then understand how you are as a person. And as you're learning through these different Twitter accounts, because all of these are feedback loops, it then feeds back into your character, you being the individual out in real life, not the person you are online. I have a friend who introduced me to it. I haven't done it as of yet, but I thought it was a really interesting concept to see how people discover themselves through having a different Twitter handle, because we all understand that when you're on Twitter is easily that you can be somewhat anonymous, and so these masks allow some people to really and truly discover who they are as a person. And so I thought that was a really cool idea. So all you Twitter people out there, maybe you want to look into who you are as a person and take up some alternative Twitter accounts, even though that sounds so shady. So yeah, I don't know how you're going to do that. I might do it myself because I'm not big on Twitter at all. And on Instagram, my personal account, I haven't posted for nearly 3 years, which I really, really have to correct. But all that aside, yes, like I said, I'm doing very well, 1st of March, but I'm doing very well under the backdrop that we are somewhat in doomsday-like conditions. You got floods down in Wales, you got the bushfires that were in Australia, you've got Turkey and Syria going at it, and all I could think about is these are end of world or end of day stuff, and it is kind of weird how it's all coming together. And all of this is culminated by our trusty friend, the coronavirus. For my fellow wanderers out there who have listened to previous episodes, you may remember me talking about coronavirus in the episode Does Language Shape the Way We Think? For those of you who haven't listened to it, it's a really good episode, Does Language Shape the Way We Think? And I look into how the structure of language helps shape the way we think about certain situations, and how language that we're brought up with can actually affect how we perceive reality around us. So for all of you that have not listened to it, I would suggest go listen to Does Language Shape the Way We Think? Anyway, in that episode, I did refer to a little story back in the 1980s regarding a candy named AIDS. And basically the whole story was about how the virus AIDS came out, and there was a candy by the name of AIDS but spelt differently, however had the same pronunciation. And at the end of this, it resulted in the candy AIDS having a really, really steep fall in sales because its name was so closely associated with this really bad disease. And so fast forward 40 years later, we have a somewhat similar situation with the coronavirus. The coronavirus is now getting a bit serious for those of you who haven't been keeping up. I, for some reason, have it on like a live ticker most days, and I'm just on The Guardian checking up, because it's like one of those games where you're looking at a world map and then you're just seeing something grow, and you see one dot in like China, then you see one dot in America, then another dot in Brazil, and then there's like just dots like coming off all over the place, and then next thing you know, we have the pandemic. But yes, coronavirus is spreading, so for all of you who are out there, make sure you are using your antibacterial gels, washing your hands, and staying away from anyone who is showing any symptoms, because God knows we do not need a pandemic in London, because as I've repeatedly said, we do not have the powers to control the public like China do. China are they're an autocracy, so they can basically just tell everyone stay at home for a month and everyone will do it. You can't do that in London. So I don't want to be alarmist, but we are not China, and our chances of containment are very low. So what we can do now is just basically mitigate any sort of fatalities or any sorts of extreme fatalities that we may end up having. So yeah, that's coronavirus. Hopefully it passes out soon, like your favorite president says.
Disappear one day, it's like a miracle, it will disappear. And from our shore,
if that does happen, then hopefully we will be speaking about this as a pastime. But it is getting kind of serious. They're talking about maybe postponing the Olympic Games. A lot of football matches in Italy have been cancelled. And Switzerland, I believe, have banned all public events with more than 1,000 people. France are doing the same with but with a different amount of 5,000 people. Governments are trying to keep everyone calm, but make sure that the economy doesn't slow down at the same time. So it is a very, very sticky situation we're all in. This then leads to the question as to what would we all do if we were stuck at home for 2 whole weeks? And with coronavirus taking a foothold across the globe, financial markets were actually like really dealt a big blow, and it was like one of the biggest financial crashes since 2008. But one of the few shares that went up was Netflix, because if you think about it, what will a lot of people do if they're all trapped at home, and a lot of people will play Netflix. But another idea that came to mind as to what people would do is that people would play a lot of card games. And I saw a meme around a card game called Cards Against Humanity, and in the game you're basically presented with 2 decks of cards. One has black cards with questions, and another deck has white cards with answers on it, and the aim of the game is to make the most politically incorrect answer you can think of. And I saw a very funny meme in regards to coronavirus and Cards of Humanity, and it read, "Boris Johnson, this is your captain speaking. Fasten your seatbelts and prepare for civilian casualties." And I don't know why that just like tickled me. However, that just really got me in the mindset of what would we do if we were all stuck at home, and playing cards were a big form of that. This then led me to think further about what playing cards actually represent and how they've developed through time and influenced things beyond immediate thought. And similar to my last episode on wine, the episode is called "In Wine We Trust." I believe playing cards are another item that kind of like stand the test of time. They've traveled across many continents in the world, and they've also evolved alongside culture. And I was trying to think of a term for items like these, items that they basically reflect human culture and human life. And I found back in 1977 there was a spacecraft called the Golden Voyage spacecraft, and within it they held records which had sounds and images that portrayed how diverse life was on Earth at the time. And they put these records onto these spacecraft and they sent them into space like tiny bottles of information into like the ocean that is space. And when they sent them off, it was with the anticipation that if there's any alien civilization out there, and if they're advanced enough, they'll be able to read these records and see how we lived as a society, as a civilization on Earth. And I thought this was a really cool concept, and I was gonna somewhat steal the concept and use it for these items that I'm having a wonder about. So I'm gonna start calling them golden eggs. So the Golden Voyage had golden records, and these are just golden eggs, little nuggets of things of human history that kind of go as far as possible. I don't think that name's gonna stick. Yeah, I don't know. But anyway, so this episode is going to be on playing cards and how they've advanced or evolved throughout time and how they've influenced culture. So before I get into that, we have a very small interlude to proceed. So we all know what playing cards are. The deck of 52, 4 suits and 13 cards in each suit. But when you actually look into it, playing cards didn't actually start off this way. Playing cards were discovered back in the 9th century, back in Asia. And these were used as a pastime for very upper class people such as kings and queens. And I think it's fairly interesting. There's something to be said about a lot of things that have survived the test of time have originated in Asia. Not to say that there aren't other things that were discovered in Africa, Europe, the Middle East, but it all just goes to show that Asia has a big part to play in this particular topic of items in the world that just continue to evolve and continue to find a way to infiltrate popular culture. So the cards that originated back in Asia, they were very influential when they were made into paper. And as we all know, paper was also originated in Asia as well. So when playing cards were created, they were very similar to money at the time. And in being similar to money, they were both used as tools for the game and then also used as what you would put on stake as to whether you would win or lose. So effectively, your money, the cards were both your money and what you used to play the games. And similar to wine, it was merchants that came from Asia that took this game into the global sphere, and it then found its way to Egypt. And it was within Egypt that the game somewhat mutated and then became a bit more structured, and the Egyptians added a class system to the card game, and what they based the class system on was what they were interested in at the time. So these were things like goblets, which are basically cups, coins, swords, and polo sticks. So as playing cards continued to travel west from Asia, they found their way to Egypt. Egypt had their little, or the Middle East, should I say, and within the Middle East, the game began to develop, change, and differentiate itself from the Asian form of the game. And moving further west, as it reached Europe, Europeans began to make their own version of playing decks. And so if you fast forward to around the 1400s, I believe it was, card games were being printed in Germany, and each Germany had started using their own sort of suit system, which they developed from the Italians. And you know, when it becomes a very egotistical thing for everyone to have their own personalized version of something. However, the reason why playing cards became so prominent is because we forget that the internet has not existed for a very long time, and people really had to look far and wide for ways to entertain themselves. It wasn't a case of you can just take a device out of your pocket and entertain yourself for 4 hours straight without disruption. So playing cards became this really popular way of socializing. It became a popular way of promoting relationships, and there was some somewhat mental benefits that even back then people used to notice. And playing cards and playing card games used to keep people's mind sharp. There are a lot of stories of wartime stories of army soldiers in their spare time when they're waiting in between battles that they would use playing cards to keep themselves entertained. And this just goes to show how playing cards became so dominant in human culture. And fast forward another 1,000 years to around the 15th century, the French get their hands on playing cards, and that's when they really take a hold and become one of the more important makers of playing cards. And as English and French colonialism decided to take over the world, so did the playing cards that these countries used to use. And it was in France that they developed their own suits, which would end up as to what we know to be hearts, spades, diamonds, and clubs. So we can thank the French for giving us the suits we use now. However, it wasn't until playing cards went to England that they became very, very standardized. And in France, you had a lot of different, designs, as each, I believe, district was allowed to design their cards in different ways. And it wasn't until the cards reached England and England decided that, nope, we're just going to use one single design, that cards really became a homogeneous sort of product, and every card was the same. So that was just a short history of playing cards. It's not an in-depth recount because, again, this ain't a history podcast. So if you do want to do some more research, if you're really keen to find out more about how playing cards came into existence, please do your own research, and also send me some of that research because I would love to know even more. But that was just a brief overview to demonstrate how universal playing cards are and how long they've been used by both the public now and even back when it was safer to drink wine than it was to drink water. But aside from how it's been used in human culture and just as a pastime, as a game, if you remember during the history recount, the cards traveled from Asia into the Middle East. And whilst they were in the Middle East, there was a period where countries in the Middle East were very focused on the calendar year and representing things of the calendar year through games that they play. And you can see this in playing cards, because when you see that there are 52 cards in a deck, you can see this as representing 52 weeks in a year. And then if you look at there are 4 suits in every deck, you can see the 4 suits as representing 4 seasons. Then if you look even further than that, there are 13 cards in each suit, which could stand for 13 weeks in each season. And when you look at the court cards, and the court cards are the cards that aren't the numbered cards and also not the ace. And these are the kings, queens, and jacks. There are 4 of each, and 4 times 3 equals 12. And 12 court cards are the same amount of months in a year. This could all be sheer coincidence, or it could be very clever design by the Arab countries in order to make sure that the cards are representative of something. And as they've developed through history, we now have the same sort of structure. However, we just see it as, oh yeah, it makes sense that there's 52 cards in a deck. But when you have a wonder about it and do some more research, you can see there's a lot of symbolism in what we have now that goes to show that it has been influenced multiple times throughout history to then evolve into the final product that we have now. Even down to the kings on the cards and the queens on the cards, these were references when they became such global items by the French. And the King of Hearts is actually it represents King Charlemagne, who was the first Holy Roman Emperor. The King of Clubs is Alexander the Great. The King of Diamonds is Julius Caesar, and the King of Spades is King David of Israel. So I thought that was really cool. The queens, on the other hand, you have Queen of Spades, which is Athena, which is the Greek goddess of war. And then the Queen of Hearts is Judith, who is more of a biblical figure, and that is also Latin for queen. So we can see in the cards that we have now, these have been influenced throughout history. And again, this is just goes to show how timeless something like playing cards are, but they're so synonymous with human culture. We somewhat overlook it, similar to wine. We have these things around us that are like big indicators of how we've got to certain stages, or just small subset stories of humankind. And I find these really interesting, just to see how they've developed throughout history, and just having a wonder as to what life would be like without certain things such as playing cards and wine, because they have such a rich history that's intertwined with humankind. And because we can't imagine life without it, that's why we somewhat overlook it, because it's just synonymous with humankind. But it would be quite interesting to see what would somewhat either replace, or what life would be like with a void of little things such as wine and playing cards. And I did read something rather interesting in regards to the somewhat structure of a deck of 52. So we all know that the only cards that have pictures on them are the kings, queens, and jacks, and then the rest of the cards are simply numbers. This was, to some people, done intentionally, because back then in kingdoms, the importance always lied in the kings, queens, and the people of the courts. However, they didn't see the population as that important, so they're just represented through numbered cards. And when you look at how life has developed through history, you can say this is reflection of maybe times that we have now, where there's some individuals at the top that are seen more and deemed more important than the rest of us, who are just deemed as numbers on a board, or numbers on the stock market, or numbers on a spreadsheet, or something like that. So I believe cards are even symbolic in that form as well. So I thought that was a really interesting way to look at playing cards as well. So with all this being said, I'm just going to end with our last topic, which is just looking at cards and magic, and that will begin shortly after this interlude. So playing cards also have a big relationship with magic, and I'm sure we've all heard of famous magicians such as Derren Brown and David Blaine. And actually thinking about it, one of my favorite movies is one about magicians called Prestige, and I believe it's starring Hugh Jackman and Christian Bale. I would recommend it for anyone who's really not interested in magic. It's actually just a really cool movie. It's kind of old now. I think it's back in 2006, 2007, and it's basically magicians back in like the medieval ages, and they're these two rivals, and you see them and you see their rivalry like throughout the years and how it develops and whatnot. It's kind of interesting. I'm probably not selling it that well, but I would recommend it for anyone. But the reason why I bring this up is because playing cards are literally like magician 101 when it comes to like doing tricks and whatnot. And the reason is because there's some psychology when it comes to playing cards and how people perceive playing cards. Studies have been done when they try and match up a magician's intuition as to what cards some of his participants will pick, and also what cards resonate more with the participants in that trick. And what they've discovered is by slight misdirection and sleight of hand and maybe just persuasion whilst having a visual stimuli can influence what a person will pick. And this is how magicians have used playing cards throughout the ages to basically wow their audience. And when you just look at it from a numbers perspective, with 52 different cards and God knows how many ways to arrange those cards, to prepare those cards, that also leaves like a multitude of ways to actually create magic for people. And it also leaves room for a magician to actually further diagnose the person who's partaking in the magic trick. If they use their cards at the beginning to see if you're more likely to pick a very random number or to pick a very prominent number, such as an ace of spades, instead of picking maybe a more obscure number like a six of clubs, a magician can somewhat suss out what type of participant they have on their hands and how they can deal with the person. And this just kind of shows playing cards in a different light, and magicians always use playing cards as a oh wow, like crazy. And it's because playing cards they're so small, but they have such a big impact when the final magic piece lands. So this is why magicians throughout the ages have continuously used playing cards. I thought that was just something to also look at. And I also thought there was maybe something to look at in regards to playing cards and addiction and how that's played a part. But that's another talk for another day. So thank you for listening. This is another episode of the Mind Wanderers podcast, another book for the library that is your mind. I'm your host, Timi. Remember, you can reach the podcast on Instagram at mindwanderers_podcast and on Twitter at mind_wanderers. So it's been a pleasure. I'll see you guys in 2 weeks' time. I hope to have a very, very special guest for you guys. So until then, peace.